What's going on, guys? If you're watching this video, hopefully you are here to learn about some car basics. We're going to walk through a lot of the stuff that's under the hood. If you like this video, if you find it helpful, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. And if there's anything in this video that you want me to cover in more detail, drop it down in the comments below and we'll dive into that specific thing more in depth in a separate video. We're just going to jump right in, start over here on the driver's side. Okay, so we've got what we call the master cylinder. What this is what holds the brake fluid. If you look right here on the cap, it's going to call out what kind of fluid is actually used. This one is .3. Just so you know, if you've got a .3, you can use a .4. You can always, it's all backwards compatible, but you never want to use, if you got one that calls for .4, you don't want to use a .3. Now, the difference is there's also a .5. .5 is not compatible with any of them. That is a completely separate silicone-based brake fluid, but .3 and .4, once again, are backwards compatible. So this is going to hold, once again, all your brake fluid. You're going to have lines that come off the side of this. These lines are what are going to run down to, in this application, an ABS module, but eventually those run to each wheel. That's what gives braking power to each wheel. Now if we look down a little further, down here, this is the ABS module. What that does is that's an anti-lock braking system. So when you slam on the brakes, you don't want your wheels to lock up. If your wheels lock up, you lose all your steering. And actually, using ABS and modulating the brakes on and off, you're going to slow down faster than if you lock those things up. So what that does is basically, when you give it pressure here, ABS module kicks on and it modulates that pressure on and off, on and off, on and off. That keeps your wheels, once again, from locking up. And then what we have back here, this is a brake booster. So when you step on the brakes in the cab, there's a rod that comes through and actually pushes a plunger inside this master cylinder. That's where it pushes out that fluid to go to all your brakes. Now, without a booster, in an old school system, they did not have power brakes. It worked just fine. What this booster does is lowers the amount of pressure you have to put on that brake pedal in order to get adequate pressure to all your wheels. So power brakes make it tremendously easier to stop your vehicle. You don't have to completely stand on it with all your weight. Now the way this works is basically you got a line coming off of here, runs over to your intake. Now your intake has vacuum on it, so it provides vacuum to this booster, and that is once again what's going to give you those power brakes. Now moving from our brakes over here, this is our power steering reservoir. Once again, if you have an older vehicle, didn't have power steering, works just fine. It was just a lot harder to turn, especially if you're sitting in a parking lot or something like that. Now, with hydraulic power steering, this fluid is being provided down to a pump that runs off the belt. That provides hydraulic pressure, so when you turn the wheel, that pressure is actually what's pushing your wheels one direction or the other. These things will leak. Most common thing you would see on this is if you start to get a whining sound, a lot of times can come from power steering, and it can be that your fluid is low because you have a leak. Now we move over here. This is actually where our air filter is going to be located. This is going to look different on all vehicles, but you can always just kind of follow this around to where it goes into the throttle body and the intake. If you follow that back around, you're going to find the air filter. Of course, the air filter's job is simple. We have air coming in that's dirty. It's going to pull all the debris and dirt out of that air before that air is allowed to go into the engine. Air filter is something that is so overlooked. Don't forget to change your air filter. It's a good thing to, at minimum, do once a year. Then we've got our coolant tank. Once again, self-explanatory. This is a pressurized tank. So you see it's got a pressure call out on the top of the tank. that tells me it's pressurized. This is where you add coolant to the system. As we look over here, there is no radiator cap on this one. Now if it had a separate radiator cap and a tank, that tank is likely just an overflow. And in that scenario, once again, it's just catches coolant. If it gets puked out, allows it to be pulled back in. When it's a pressurized tank like this, it actually has active flow in it. So when you start that vehicle, water pump starts to move coolant through the system. It's going to be flowing in and out of this tank at all times. Now, other things we see over here, this box is just a fuse box. So self-explanatory, it's full of fuses and relays. We move up. This is actually something that is on older vehicles as well. This is a little motor that runs all the way over to our throttle plate. And what that does is when you set your cruise control, this little motor is what is going to power that, give it more throttle if needed, less. Newer vehicles aren't going to have that because they have an electronic throttle body. Now we're getting into the engine itself. Once again, this is where the air comes into the engine. So there's going to be a throttle body and stuff. We're going to go ahead and remove this cover so we can show it to you. So now that we have our cover off, we can see this is our throttle body. This is an old school vehicle, so it still has a throttle cable. So what happens is when you step on the gas, this opens up, which opens up a valve in there that lets air into the engine. That's how you rev it up. Air goes into the engine, goes to all the cylinders. We see right here, this is a fuel rail, so fuel injected vehicles. That air flows into the engine. Fuel gets sprayed. That air and fuel mixture kind of tumbles together. Valve opens, it gets pulled into that engine. That's how the combustion cycle happens. Now the engine has sensors to know how much air is coming into it. We look here, this is actually an air temperature sensor. So it wants to know what temperature the air is coming in. Colder air is going to be more dense than hot. And then all the way down here on the bottom, there's a sensor. That is your mass airflow sensor. What that's going to do is meter how much air is coming into the engine. So when you open that throttle plate, more air gets pulled into the engine. It knows that. So it knows that it's going to need more fuel, be able to make more power, get more RPMs. So when you step on the gas, it does what you think it's supposed to do. Now newer vehicles are all what we call drive-by-wire, meaning that there is no cable. So there is no physical connection between that throttle plate and the gas pedal on the inside anymore. What they do now is there's a sensor that can tell how much you're pushing the gas pedal down, and this is an electric motor. So as you press the gas pedal, it will automatically open and close that throttle plate so you get the RPM that you want. Now I'm just going to go ahead and pull this air intake off of here so we can get down to some of the components down below. Now we can see that throttle body. You can see what happens whenever you give it the gas. That throttle plate just opens up and allows air in. And then right in here, where our airflow is going to come through, kind of hard to see, but that mass airflow sensor, air flows across it, so it knows how much air is coming in. Now, when we're looking at the front of the engine, look right down here, we can see a belt. When your engine starts, your crank starts to spin, spins that belt. There's a lot of things that work off of that belt spinning. What you see right here, that is going to be your alternator. So what your alternator is going to do is charge your battery. So battery's right here, 12 volts. That's what allows you to start the engine. But with all the electronics that are on cars nowadays, that battery is not going to be able to keep up. So we spin this alternator. That's going to power everything as well as keep this battery charged. And as we're looking down at the belt, that is our power steering pump. We talked about what that does. We move over. Here is our water pump. So that is what circulates coolant, keeps our vehicle cool. Attached to the front of that, we can see a fan. That is what's going to blow across the radiator to cool the coolant down as it goes through the radiator if you're not driving down the road. If you're just sitting in traffic, it's got to have a way to keep it cool. Now this vehicle has a fan clutch. So basically as that heats up, it's going to engage that clutch, allow that fan to spin. Most modern vehicles are all electric fans, meaning there's just an electric motor. The computer turns that fan on and off as needed. Then when you get over to this side, you've got an idler pulley, so that doesn't do anything but hold the belt. Below that, we have a tensioner. That is what keeps the belt tension so it doesn't come off. And then below that, we have the air conditioner compressor. That is what's going to make our air conditioner work. So when we talk about that water pump, when you start this engine, that water pump starts to spin, starts to move coolant. Coolant is going to flow through the engine, through the heads. There's a heater core. It's located in the cab. That's where hot air blows across to give you heat inside the cab. Makes full circulation. And then you have an upper radiator hose. And then on that side, you've got a lower radiator hose. So basically you're going to have one of the hoses is your inlet. One of your hoses is the outlet of the radiator. So hot coolant flows into the radiator. Air blows across the radiator from driving down the road and or the fan. And then the coolant that is now cooled off gets circulated back to the engine to cool that engine. The cycle just repeats. And there's just a constant loop. Now if we look through the front grille, you can see the radiator. That is once again what air is going to blow across to cool that coolant. Now as we continue to move to the passenger side, we have got the place to add engine oil. It's going to call out what engine oil that engine wants. This one actually also has a transmission dipstick on this side, so I can check the transmission fluid level. The engine oil dipstick is right over here on this side. Of course, we talked about our battery. That is what gives us the power to run everything electrically. It works with the alternator, but the battery is what's going to store the power. So while this vehicle is sitting here, that's why you can walk out in the morning and start your vehicle, because that battery has stored the power, sends the power to the starter, which starts to crank the engine over, starts the combustion process. Once that starts, you get that belt moving. Now you're moving the alternator and you're putting power back into that battery. Now I hear people ask about this all the time. Under your hood, you're going to see these have little caps on them. This cap will just thread off of there. There's going to be two of them, a low side and a high side. Unless you know what you're doing, you don't ever need to mess with these. This is the low side and the high side ports for checking and recharging your air conditioner. So your refrigerant goes into these lines. And then the final thing, we've got our washer fluid tank. So this is what, when you pull back on your windshield wiper knob, you're able to spray your windshield to clean it. This is where that fluid lives. Now there's a little pump in the bottom of this. So whenever you turn it on, basically what it's going to do is going to pump that fluid up through this line, and it's going to come out the sprayers on the hood to spray up on the windshield. Now speaking of the windshield wipers, we can't see it on this application, and a lot of them are the same way. Your windshield wipers have a motor that powers them. To access it on this vehicle and most others, you're going to have to take this cowling off, and you're going to have a motor with some linkage down underneath. Since we've got this all apart, we might as well go ahead and check our air filter while we're at it. So you can see air comes in this side, runs through that filter. The clean air is going to come from the inside and go off to the engine. So what we're looking for is debris in here. So this is a reusable style filter. So this one I can clean and put back in. And it's not too bad, but if this thing was caked up with dirt, grime, debris, bunch of bugs, leaves down in these pleats, you're going to want to change that filter. Now everyone has heard of getting a tune-up on your vehicle. Usually what that's going to entail, a modern vehicle, is simply spark plugs. But I want to point out a couple things. So we talked about the fuel rail earlier. If we look down here, those are fuel injectors. So there's going to be a fuel injector, a spark plug, and a coil for every cylinder. Now, some vehicles have a coil with spark plug wires that run to each cylinder. This vehicle specifically has one for each cylinder. So you've got a fuel injector to spray fuel into that cylinder. This is a coil. Right underneath that coil is going to be your spark plug. So you're going to have one of those for every cylinder. So in this application, I've got 4 on this side. If we look here, I've got 4 on this side as well. Now I think we covered most of the generic things under the hood. There's a few other things. So if we look here, you know, that's actually part of our EGR system. We look here, that is part of the EVAP system, as well as that. Those are all emissions components. Gets a little more in depth if you want to talk about those. But if you're interested in any of that and how those work, drop a comment below and I'll try to do a specific video on them. Hopefully you guys learned something from this video. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. If there's anything that I didn't cover that you would like me to, drop it down in the comments below. Or once again, if there's anything you want some clarification on or something completely different that you'd like to see a video on, just let me know. Appreciate you watching. See you guys next time.